The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of TechFlow Industries, casting long shadows across the pristine conference room. Sarah Mitchell sat at the head of the polished table, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, yellow cleaning gloves still on her hands from her morning routine. She looked entirely out of place among the 15 engineers in their crisp button-down shirts and tailored pants, yet something about her presence commanded the room's attention. Sarah had never expected to find herself in this position. Just 30 minutes earlier, she had been in the kitchen of the penthouse apartment above the corporate offices, preparing breakfast for 6-year-old Emma while her father, CEO David Harrison, rushed through his morning routine. Now, she found herself surrounded by some of the brightest minds in technology, all of them staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amazement. The story had begun 3 months earlier, when Sarah first knocked on David's door. She was 28, recently laid off from her teaching position due to budget cuts, and desperately needed work. The single father had been cycling through nannies for his daughter Emma at an alarming rate. Some couldn't handle Emma's boundless energy and creative spirit. Others found David's demanding schedule and frequent late nights too much to manage. But Sarah was different. She had grown up in a household where problems were solved with patience and creativity rather than force or frustration. Her grandmother had always told her that the simplest solutions were often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with fresh eyes to notice them. From her first day, Sarah brought a sense of calm to the Harrison household that had been missing for years. Emma, who had been acting out with previous nannies, took to Sarah immediately. The little girl loved Sarah's storytelling, her patient explanations of how things worked, and her ability to turn everyday activities into adventures. David noticed the change too. When he came home from long days at the office, instead of finding a frazzled nanny and an overstimulated child, he found peace. Sarah had a way of creating order without rigidity, structure without stifling Emma's natural curiosity. She approached problems the way she had approached her students' learning challenges, with patience, observation, and creative thinking. As weeks turned into months, Sarah became more than just Emma's nanny. She became part of their small family. David found himself looking forward to coming home, not just to see Emma, but to hear about Sarah's day, to see her gentle smile, to witness the way she made their house feel like a real home. The crisis that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. David's company had been working for 6 months on a revolutionary water purification system, designed to provide clean drinking water in disaster zones and remote areas. The technology was groundbreaking, potentially life-saving, but there was one insurmountable problem. The system worked perfectly in laboratory conditions, but every time they tried to scale it up for real-world use, it failed catastrophically. The filters would clog within hours instead of lasting for weeks as designed. 15 of the company's best engineers had been working around the clock, trying every solution they could imagine. Computer models, advanced algorithms, chemical analyses, pressure tests, temperature variations, nothing worked. The board of directors was growing impatient. Investors were asking hard questions. The company's reputation was on the line, and David was running out of time. That particular Tuesday, David had called an emergency meeting. The 15 engineers gathered in the conference room, their faces showing the strain of months of failed attempts. Charts covered the walls, laptops hummed with complex calculations, and the air was thick with frustration and exhaustion. David stood at the front of the room, his usually confident demeanor showing cracks. "We need fresh ideas," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "We've tried everything conventional. We need to think outside the box." The engineers began their familiar routine, pulling up data, discussing molecular structures, debating pressure ratios. The same conversations they had been having for months, leading to the same dead ends. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Sarah was helping Emma with a science project about water cycles when she heard David's voice through the building's intercom system. He was explaining the problem to his team, his words carrying clearly through the speaker in the kitchen. Emma, who had inherited her father's curiosity about how things worked, listened intently. "Why don't they just ask the water where it wants to go?" she asked innocently. Sarah smiled at the child's simple logic, but then paused. There was something in Emma's innocent question that sparked a thought. Sarah had been listening to David discuss this problem for weeks, hearing his late-night phone calls, noticing his growing stress. She had a degree in elementary education, not engineering, but she had spent years teaching children to observe the world around them, to notice patterns, to ask simple questions. As she cleaned up Emma's breakfast dishes, Sarah found herself thinking about water. Not in the complex, technical way the engineers approached it, but in the simple, observable way she might explain it to a child. Water always found the easiest path. It flowed around obstacles rather than trying to force through them. It was patient, persistent, gentle. On impulse, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. She asked the building's receptionist to watch Emma for a few minutes, then took the elevator down to the conference room. When she knocked on the door, the room fell silent. David looked surprised to see her, still wearing her yellow cleaning gloves, her hair slightly mussed from the morning routine. "Sarah, is everything okay? Is Emma all right?" David asked, concern immediately replacing his business expression. "Emma's fine," Sarah said softly. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard you discussing the water purification system. May I ask a question?" The engineers exchanged glances. David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." Sarah stepped into the room, feeling the weight of 15 pairs of skeptical eyes on her. But she had learned from teaching that confidence came from focusing on the problem, not on what others might think of you. "You said the filters clog because too much material tries to pass through too quickly," she began, her voice calm and clear. "What if, instead of trying to make the filters stronger or the pressure higher, you made the water want to go slower?" The engineers looked confused. One of them, a senior developer named Marcus, cleared his throat. "I'm not sure I understand. Water doesn't want anything. It follows physical laws." Sarah nodded patiently, the way she would with a student who was struggling with a concept. "You're absolutely right. But what if you worked with those physical laws instead of against them? What if you created a path that naturally slowed the water down, not by force but by making the journey more interesting?" She walked to the whiteboard, where complex diagrams covered every inch. Without erasing anything, she found a small clear space and drew a simple, winding path. "When I take Emma to the park, she never walks straight to the playground. She stops to look at flowers, to examine interesting rocks, to watch squirrels. She takes longer to get there, but she arrives happy and ready to play. What if your water could do something similar?" The room was completely silent now. Even the skeptical engineers were leaning forward, trying to follow her thinking. Instead of forcing water through straight channels at high pressure, Sarah continued, "What if you created a gentle, winding path? Small chambers where the water could settle and separate naturally. Like a lazy river, where the water takes its time and the heavy particles have a chance to fall out naturally." Marcus was the first to speak. "A settling cascade system," he said slowly, his eyes lighting up with understanding. "Multiple small chambers instead of one large filter. The water would naturally slow as it moves through the curves, and gravity would do most of the work." Another engineer, Jennifer, jumped up and began sketching on another whiteboard. "And if we angle the chambers correctly, we could use the water's own momentum to create gentle turbulence that would help separate the particles without clogging the filters." The room exploded into activity. Engineers began pulling up new calculations, sketching diagrams, talking excitedly about pressure ratios and flow dynamics. But now, instead of fighting against the water's natural behavior, they were working with it. David stood frozen, watching his team transform a months-old problem into a solution in real time. He looked at Sarah, who was standing quietly in the corner, still wearing her yellow gloves, watching the engineers work with a satisfied smile. Within 30 minutes, the basic design was complete. Within an hour, they had a prototype plan. The elegance of the solution was breathtaking in its simplicity. Instead of one large, high-pressure filter that would clog quickly, they would use a series of small, angled chambers that would allow the water to clean itself naturally as it flowed. As the engineers hurried off to begin building the prototype, David found himself alone with Sarah in the conference room. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. "How did you know?" he asked finally. Sarah smiled, pulling off her yellow gloves and setting them on the table. "I didn't know. I just listened. Sometimes the best solutions come from stepping back and asking simple questions." David moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Sarah, He began, then stopped, struggling with words that felt too important to get wrong. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too." The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. For months, they had both felt the growing connection, the way their separate lives had begun to weave together into something stronger and more beautiful than either had expected. "Emma needs stability," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Emma needs love," Sarah corrected gently. "And so do you. So do I." David reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I never expected this when I hired you." "Neither did I," Sarah admitted. "But sometimes the best things are the ones we don't plan for." 3 weeks later, the prototype water purification system passed its first major test. The gentle cascade design worked perfectly, cleaning water efficiently without the clogging problems that had plagued the original design. The company's stock price soared, investors were thrilled, and David found himself fielding calls from humanitarian organizations around the world. But more importantly, on a quiet Sunday morning, David Harrison asked Sarah Mitchell to marry him. Not in a grand gesture or elaborate setting, but in their kitchen, while Emma drew pictures at the table and morning sunlight streamed through the windows. Sarah said yes, not because he was a successful CEO, but because he was the man who had learned to see problems through her eyes, who had come to value her gentle wisdom as much as any engineering degree. The wedding was small and simple, held in the same conference room where Sarah had first shared her solution. Emma served as flower girl, scattering petals while wearing a miniature version of Sarah's yellow dress, a playful nod to the gloves that had started it all. As they exchanged vows, David promised to always remember that the best solutions often came from the most unexpected places. Sarah promised to always ask the simple questions that others might overlook. Their story became legend within the company, not just because of the innovative water purification system that would go on to help millions of people worldwide, but because it reminded everyone that brilliance could come from anywhere, that love could grow in the most unexpected circumstances, and that sometimes the most complex problems required the simplest solutions. Years later, when Emma was older and asked how her parents fell in love, they would tell her about the day when 15 engineers couldn't solve a problem, but her nanny could. They would tell her about yellow gloves and gentle questions, about the power of seeing things differently, and about how the best families, like the best solutions, often came together in ways no one could have planned. And Emma would smile, understanding that sometimes the most important lessons weren't about engineering or business or even science. Sometimes they were about love, patience, and the courage to speak up when you had something valuable to say.